The race is on, and with on-off meetings about F1's mooted V8 future, we ask what's really going on, plus what's all the talk of fuel costs and shorter races all about. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tackle those topics and many more are Glenn Freeman and John Noble. Well, Glenn, you're the host of our sister podcast, Back V8s, but given F1's current long-term direction, how do you feel about bringing back V8s?
I really like the idea, not just because I'm captain Bring Back V10s, but I'm excited about the idea of F1 being able to go back to loud, bone-shaking engines and being able to do it in a potentially sustainable way. For all the things that we may not like or wish were better about the hybrid engines, the efficiency gains F1 made over one winter, effectively from 2013 to 14, to be able to complete an F1 race distance using a much less fuel than we did before. That was an amazing scientific achievement, and F1 never did a good job at any point in that early transition of marketing what was good about those engines. I don't think they covered up the weaknesses in as good a way as they could. You had people like Sebastian Vettel and Bernie Ecclestone slagging those engines off right from the beginning. Ed, I remember you and I going to pre-season testing in Bahrain, standing trackside and going, these sound okay, actually. And we loved the engines that came before. So F1 mismanaged that. But I think, although I wasn't that bothered about the switch to hybrids, if we can get back to shouting, screaming, normally aspirated engines and on sustainable fuel, I think that is the right direction for F1. I saw a clip, actually, a couple of days ago from a video Red Bull made. And it's Max Verstappen talking about Red Bull's first car, the 2005 V10 car. And even he's talking about, he remembers the first time he went to an F1 track and saw those cars and heard those cars. And I think that element has been lost. Nobody talks about the sound of being trackside at F1 anymore. And the final point I'd add is that still, even today, if you see an advert on TV featuring an F1 car, quite often it will still have a V10 or a V8 soundtrack. So people in the commercial world clearly still know that the way to grab attention with an F1 car is to have the sound not muffled by a turbo hybrid.
Well, you've made a very, very good case there, and there's many, many other benefits in terms of size and weight as well. But, John, there's been a lot of talk about this, and I imagine people are a little bit confused about this meeting that was and then wasn't, and timelines. So can you just give us an overview of exactly what the state of play is?
Yeah, so this has been a topic that's been bubbling away for quite a while now. Stefano Domenicali has openly talked, maybe for 2 years now, about, we need to look at perhaps an alternative direction longer term. I think this comes from the 26 regs aren't going to be perfect. We've got this 50-50 power split. We've ended up with engines that are going to be energy starved, could have an impact on the racing. It's all going to be about energy recovery and energy management. We've got car regulations that try to kind of be a sticking plaster to this problem with movable aero. So we've ended up with some imperfect regulations that may or may not be as bad as people think, but we can't judge till they hit the track. But against that backdrop, it's pretty clear that this new direction is wanted. Mohammed Ben Sulayem, FI president, pushed quite hard. Initially, back in March time, he talked about V10s. He wanted a V10 power unit to come on. He summoned the manufacturers to a meeting in Bahrain, put it on the table, and the answer was no. The V10's not particularly road relevant for manufacturers. It was too early to make a call. Questions about if it was the right route to go down. Is a V10 make any sense when V8's a much more logical step to do? So V10s were parked, but since then talks have continued, and the next step was going to be this summit meeting in London that was scheduled for this week. Going to call people to go and try to push for the V8 in 2029, which would have mean 3 years of the new regulations and then switch. But it became pretty clear there wasn't enough support. Under the current governance rules, you needed 4 manufacturers in favour to do it. At the moment, there are 5 in that initial phase. But with Audi and Honda being a definite no against it, it was never going to get through. Plus, Mercedes and Ferrari weren't especially keen to do it. So the thing kind of tripped over before it started. But 2031 still remains on the table. It still seems the direction of travel. It still seems there is enough support to get a package in place. But I think it's going to be a slow burning process to do it, and done in the right way, where we don't come up with the engine and then come up with the car outside it. We actually come up with a holistic rules package, which is what cars do we want? What racing do we want? How heavy should the cars be? What should the power to weight ratio be? What should the aero influence be? Which I think is ultimately probably a better step than rushing in just to get a V8 back for 29.
Provided, of course, that your very optimistic conclusion there does come to pass, because historically rule changes tend to be dominated by one consideration that then kind of everything's built around. But it's an interesting scenario, Glenn, isn't it? Because that current direction would suggest that we will get the expected 2026 to 2030 cycle. That's quite a long time if this formula turns out to be as bad as some people fear it will be, even if half as bad as some people fear it will be. So I guess that's a concern for F1, isn't it? Because that's the argument for making faster changes if they feel they're lumbered with a formula that won't produce the kind of on-track product they want.
Yeah, it's a long time if the formula doesn't work on track. I'd imagine for the manufacturers who've piled a lot of money and resource into developing those new engines for 2026, a 4-year cycle feels like quite a short time. So I guess that's one of the main arguments against rushing the change. And I always felt like you guys have both outlined why these regulations in 26 are going to be a huge compromise. You talked about the engine formula that they wanted to get to. I actually feel like the goal here was just to get new manufacturers, ideally Audi, but anyone else they could. And it felt like we've ended up in a very messy situation because the goal wasn't even really technical. It was get manufacturers through the door. What do they want? And then those discussions became a bit of a mess. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think it's totally correct that the overriding ambition was to get, it was going to be Audi, you were going to get Porsche, potentially GM in the end, and it worked. We got Audi in. Honda changed their minds, but then it got lost again. This is quite an interesting snapshot in personal competitive selfishness, because when Audi came in, they said, well, these engines aren't going to produce enough power. The batteries aren't going to be powerful enough. You need to put a Kerr system on the front axle. So you need power regeneration from the front axle, power regeneration on the rear, and then that will give you enough power and the rules will be fine. But everyone felt, oh, this is Audi. They've got all this knowledge from sports cars. They'll have such an advantage. It was blocked. So this is why we've ended up in this strange world where we have these huge question marks over 26. And I think a lot of the time and impetus will depend on how things play out at the start of next year. If it's all fine, and there's kind of easy problems to fix, and you adjust some power levels or adjust how much regeneration, then I think that the push for the V8 will slow down. But if it's a problem, if there's a massive gap on the grid, if the racing's terrible, if fans don't like it, then I think that will increase the momentum. So I think there's a lot of moving parts in this topic at the moment.
Should just add on that front regen thing with Audi. Audi also played a part in the MGUH being ditched, and it'd be very useful to have the MGUH on the turbo. So that just reflects that everybody's got their own ideal position that they're pushing for, and that always underpins this. You're all battling for your own advantage. But I guess the real question, Glenn, that listeners will know is this going to be the kind of is it going to give the kind of product that people want? Is it going to give simplified engines? Is a 2013 style engine formula with a 2.4 litre V8 plus Kerrs putting out a little bit of power but not a huge amount? Is that the kind of dream world, do you think, for fans? Or shall I say a realistic dream world, if that's not a slightly contradictory construction?
I'd be interested to see what car you would get around that engine formula now, because it's scary to think, but 2013 was a long time ago, and it'll be even longer ago if we get these for, say, 2030 or 2031. So, but what I like about the idea of going back in that direction, other than the sound, which I do think is really, really important, is reducing the size and the bulk of these cars. So I feel like we've had so many compromises. We've got many more compromises to come, but I feel like if you look at an F1 car now, they're ridiculously big. They don't need to be that big. So being able to shrink the cars down a bit, I think would be good, hopefully for the spectacle, and it'd be good for the drivers as well. No driver wants to lug around these cars as heavy and wallowy as they can be right now. They want something nimble that they can really throw around a bit. So I think you would get that positive reaction from the drivers, and that will translate to the fans. I think these days, especially with the way the driver-fan connection is, happy drivers tend to mean happy fans as well. But I'd be curious. It all comes down to what sort of car rules and chassis regulations get put around those smaller engines if they come back.
So, John, what do you think is the timeline for all of this? I guess, logically, if we want this mythical, holistic rules package that considers everything, they'll need some of next year to happen so they can get some data on how the changes that they've made to the car, because there's some things that they've done that are designed to mitigate the dreaded outwash and make following better. So there's some things to learn there. But when do you think, realistically, there can be sort of the broad agreement on the key areas, the engine, the hybrid element, the basic philosophy of the chassis regs?
Well, we know 29 is now off the table because Ben Slime told the teams that this isn't going to happen, that the Audi and Honda, block on 29 means there's absolutely no chance of that happening. He says 31 is more realistic, and that's when all the current governance structures all end. So in theory, the FIA could, and if I think previous presidents may well have done this, they can publish whatever regulations they want tomorrow for 2031, put them in the rules, and if teams want to sign up, they can sign up, and if they don't, they can go and do something else. But I don't think that's potentially the right result and would be a very healthy situation. So I think at the moment, the work will be done towards 31. But then the question is, as I mentioned earlier, if 26 regs aren't working, then I think the impetus will come back towards 2030. Because I think there's enough support for it. You've got Red Bull and Cadillac potentially in favour of 2030. You've got Ferrari and Mercedes didn't want 29, but would be happy with 30. So you'd only have Audi and Honda potentially against it. And I think in a scenario that 4 manufacturers are in favour of something for 30, and the reasons were genuine, that the regs aren't working, one of them's behind and needs to catch up, or a big change is needed, then I think 30 could come onto the table. And from what I understand from the FIA, that although Ben Salam's talking about 31, I think if the manufacturers come together with a package and say this is what we want, he's open to it.
Would these does simpler equal cheaper here as well? So if the manufacturers they've put so much money into hybrids, the previous generation for the manufacturers are here, we know these engines are going to be expensive. Someone like Audi, who is going to be one of the ones that would need convincing, is one of the arguments that can be made is, right, you're here, you're established in F1 now, this engine will be cheaper. Or if we're starting from scratch again with a V8, is that another massive, expensive start from scratch development project for any manufacturer who has to consider this and potentially approve it?
Yeah, well, it will cost, obviously, because any new technology does. How much it costs depend on the regs, and obviously the cost cap, there's an engine cost cap, will be a big part of that. So that'll be a big part of the discussion in terms of where they pitch it in terms of the overall cost. Because if you just set the spending based on what you can do under the regs, the engine manufacturers will find endless ways to spend money because there's always something you can spend money on for an incremental gain. So cost cap mechanism for engines and the spending mechanism will be the key dictator of that.
Yeah, from what I understand, the proposal that was on the table for the V8, both the kind of the per unit cost is brought down a lot, which is helped by a lot more standard components, standard gearboxes, cheaper transmission parts, potentially standard batteries. There's a lot of cheaper elements to bring down the per unit cost. But that would be hand in hand with what was a roughly 30% reduction in cost cap. So the cost cap ultimately dictates how much a manufacturer spends each year. So if the cost cap comes down by 30%, after 3 years, you end up being cheaper than the current turbo hybrids. The only elephant in the room on that argument is the development costs, because manufacturers are going to have to develop a new engine. So you've got to offset all these elements together a little bit. And I think at the moment, and this is what manufacturers wrote to Ben Suleiman and told him, the world's changed since Bahrain. The impact of Trump's tariffs in the USA has kind of really impacted the automotive markets. Chinese economy slowdown isn't helping matters, and governments all around the world are flip-flopping on the rush to electric cars, that some of them want to roll back on it. The infrastructures aren't ready. So the car makers haven't got a clear direction. They don't know what their roadmap is for 3 or 4, 5 years' time, when in their ideal world, they're planning 10, 15 years down the road. So I think the thirst and appetite for them to embark on an extra development project at the time of these engines isn't very great at the moment.
Yeah, and of course, these parameters will endlessly change, and F1 has to decide exactly where it wants to pitch itself in terms of the engine technology and the role it feels manufacturers play. So there's some big philosophical questions to be tackled there. And even if the general direction is right, I remain to be convinced I come up with the right answer. But let's see what happens over the next couple of years, I guess now is what we're going to be looking at. Well, John, let's get on to fuel now, because Formula One's rightly very excited about its move to sustainable fuel next year, but it has become controversial given the costs involved. So why has this become such a big problem, and what was the recent meeting all about?
Money, basically, has become the problem. That I think as manufacturers and the fuel manufacturers have worked on this fuel, I think they've realised that it's very expensive. Some of the materials involved is very expensive. The supply chains aren't very big, so that's very expensive. And we've ended up in a scenario where fuel prices have jumped from, maybe 20, 30 euros or dollars, whichever way around, litres per litre with the current fuel, up to 300 plus for the new fuel. And this means fuel bills for teams that have to pay for their fuel. Now, not everyone has to pay for their fuel because of their commercial agreements. But if you're a team that is paying for your fuel, I think one team boss told me their fuel bill jumps from around $4 million to $12 million per year next season. And I understand that the peak fuel bill at the moment from one manufacturer is 15 million is peaking out at, which is a lot of extra cash to be found. It's outside the cost cap, luckily, because otherwise, I think if it had been inside the cost cap, then teams wouldn't be able to afford any staff or car developments. So that's the only kind of benefit at the moment, is that it's outside the cost cap. So it's just about finding extra cash. It's not cutting back in other areas. But it's a big problem, and it's something that needs addressing because, as I think Ayao Komatsu mentioned to us a few last weekends, the fuel's sustainable, the finances aren't.
Yeah, that's the big challenge, and I guess they'll be able to. It should be relatively easy to try and identify some of the components and things that are costing the money. But then again, others might crop up as well, because this is a fast-moving sphere. So, yeah, that could be a moving target. But Glenn, what do you make of the fuel situation? Should fuel be a talking point? Should fuel not be a talking point? A lot of series have spec fuels. Does this matter to fans, or do you like the fuel competition that's always been a big part of Grand Prix racing?
Yeah, I think from the spectacle point of view, it falls into one of those categories where it's an unseen battle that if you know about it, it's fascinating. But to the majority of fans, even quite dedicated fans, I would say, it doesn't mean very much to them. My personal view as a lifelong F1 fan, it wouldn't bother me at all if F1 had control fuel. I'm interested in it when people like John dig into it and talk about, John, I think over the years, John, you've been able to do quite a lot of stories with fuel companies about all the things they're up to. And then you go, wow, I didn't really realize this was going on, but I could happily do without it. The thing that makes me think F1 maybe couldn't go in that direction is one of the things John mentioned there. Fuel partners, fuel and oil companies have been big financial backers of Formula One and motorsport for as long as any of us can remember, and way before any of us were around. Some of the initial big sponsors were often oil companies, and teams rely on the resources, but also just the funding. So I'd imagine if you go down control fuel, do these oil companies still want to be around just to use F1 cars and to use F1 as a billboard? Or do they all go, why are we going to badge someone else's fuel, and this sport isn't for us anymore?
Yeah, this is the problem with it. The story about fuel is difficult because it's there, but it's so hard to tell because you can't illustrate it. You can't point to an aero shape in the fuel.
They
and
all
say
look the
it's
same,
that.
don't they?
Exactly. It's just fluid, isn't it? And that's how people will see it. But yeah, I do wonder, because there are those who would like a spec fuel, and I do wonder if there's arguments about that, whether there's some way to get the fuel companies to be a bit more forthcoming on the details. And fuel companies generally, they communicate quite well about the general things they're doing, but maybe there's some way to force them to be more open and say, right, this fuel spec this year is giving us exactly this extra or something. I don't know, but maybe that's a bit of a fantasy world. But John, I guess this whole thing goes hand in hand in terms of the longer term with the V8 engine future as well, what fuel they want for that, while just kind of controlling what they've got for this next rule cycle and just stopping it getting too out of control.
Yeah, so FI had a meeting this week with the fuel suppliers just to try to kind of start the ball rolling on what can be done. So is the solution, more standard kind of components amongst the sustainable fuels? So you give the manufacturers a window of 10% of the product or 20% or 50% of the product that they can do what they want with. But this is in areas that are quite cheap or that's not going to make a huge expense. So you can bring the cost down that way. So there are options being looked at. And I think the other thing that F1 also has to be aware of is that, by going down this route, it will open the supply chains and it will give governments belief that sustainable fuel perhaps is an option, for the wider public. So they will invest in it. And then the costs rapidly come down. So F1's very good at this. The key thing is if the cost can come down aggressively enough for this not to be a problem for teams. Because I think if teams are having to spend $12 million per year, even if it goes down to $10 million per year, it's a lot of extra cash being flown around. And one team boss joked with me, he said, I've got to find an extra $8 million per year because this fuel's sustainable. How many transatlantic plane trips am I going to have to make for me and my commercial staff to try to get sponsors to do this? So in the end, I think, it wouldn't balance out totally, but I think he had a point that this money's got to come from somewhere. And just because it's the fuel sustainable in one place, if it's causing problems elsewhere, it also doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the word sustainable is one that does a lot of heavy lifting and shrouds a lot of problems. And it's great that F1's got this full supply chain thing in terms of you're looking at the whole thing, the whole process, not just the end product, but everything you do to make it. But then you've got the other things such as the financial side. So it's very, very challenging, but it's good that they're trying to tackle it now. And yeah, that's something I have to keep a constant close eye on. Let's move on now, Glenn, to this talk about shorter F1 races. We'll come on to why that's maybe a tiny bit misleading in a moment. But with your Bring Back V10s hat on, is that idea entirely against the spirit of Grand Prix racing?
Well, that's the thing. It's not a V10 era thing, is it? F1 races have been as long as they are now, way before the 1990s. There's a lot of things I would consider changing about F1. Some of them very radical that would upset a lot of hardcore fans. But the race distance is never one that comes to my mind. I think if an F1 race ever feels too long, the thing I'd be looking to tackle there is to make the race less boring, not to make it shorter. If anyone's moaning about the length of the competition, it's because it's not exciting enough. So if you shorten it, you would just have a shorter version of the same thing that isn't really entertaining enough, which brings me on to F1's got its very own case study, which is sprint races. We already have shorter races 6 times a year, and most people complain that they're not very entertaining and a bit rubbish.
Well, yeah, that is a very good sample set. But let's now, John, just look at actually what Stefano Domenicali has been talking about and what this could mean, because it's maybe not quite as straightforward as it appears.
Yeah, because speaking in the paddock, the impression that lots of questions in media sessions and it's all going around that Stefano Domenicali wants shorter races and is looking at it, and this is what people responded to, and it had all the kickback. I don't think anyone was particularly supportive of it. Lots of the arguments didn't make sense. His suggestion that yet more and more people are watching highlights doesn't necessarily mean they want shorter races. Highlights are free on YouTube. Races are behind paywalls on TV. So there are multiple arguments as to why highlights are more popular than the full race. But if you go dig back to what actually Domenicali said, it was an Italian media session, pre-Italian Grand Prix, and the topic came up about potential change of the future. And it came up that their evidence shows the younger fans don't particularly like longer races, that the highlights are more popular. But this was all correct. But he never actually said he was looking at shorter races. It was just the fact that an audience likes a particular kind of length of coverage. And it didn't dig into the details, because I think the arguments against shortening races are absolutely massive. You end up with nailed on one-stoppers, easy one-stoppers races. The strategy goes out the window unless you have a ludicrous situation of super soft tyres where drivers are stopping. Sprint races, I don't think we've had a single sprint race that we can say hands down was better than a Grand Prix. They've been interesting. They've added intrigue to an overall weekend, I think, at times. But I can't recall a sprint race that has been an absolute barnstormer of a race and has been better. So I think it's one of those that it got ahead of steam. But I think the reality from FOM is that the race length works fine. But they obviously need to understand the dynamics of free-to-air versus pay-TV versus what the younger generation wants, how they're consuming content, because it's no longer about tuning in at 2 o'clock and watching it. You can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it on social media. You can watch it on the F1 TV. There's numerous touch points. And then we get the platform from there, and it's about making the entertainment factor. Because I think there's also a nonsense to say young people don't like long stuff because they binge watch Netflix series and they will play computer games for hours and hours and hours and hours on end. It's about the overall entertainment of the product. It's not about how long a sporting event is.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The whole short attention span thing is just something out of touch people say. I did want to pick up on that highlights argument. I really enjoyed seeing the backlash over this. It's the most united I think I've ever seen the F1 fan base over anything, and it was really good how people were pushing back. The main reaction I saw, which is one John hinted at there, was a lot of the time the people who are watching highlights are doing it because they can't afford to watch it live. And I think that's a really important point. It actually got me thinking. I went to the supermarket yesterday, and when I went to pick up a loaf of bread, the budget racks of bread were empty. They'd all been sold out, and some of the nice, flashy branded ones were still there. But that's not because people prefer cheap bread. It's because people have to manage their money and cut their cloth accordingly. I can imagine if this conversation came up, if someone, if in a supermarket, and the supermarket boss is going, "Oh, everyone prefers cheap, crappy bread. Maybe that's the direction we need to go and what we're stocking next." That you're misinterpreting what's going on there. But I also think there's another type of fan who watches highlights, and that's a particular type of casual fan. Now, I know casual fans make everybody's eyes light up. They're the ones you've got to get. But there are some casual fans you're never going to convert. You've got those people who have a passing interest. Who won the race this weekend? Those people might watch an 8-minute highlights edit on YouTube, but they're not really people you're ever going to convert to go and pay a fortune to watch the race live on whichever overpriced platform they have to use. I look at myself. There are loads of sports that I love and follow, but I follow them in a casual way, usually down to time or money. Those are the two reasons I can't follow them in more detail. So I keep up with them, usually with brilliant official 10-minute or 15-minute YouTube highlights edits. That's great. But at no point does the fact that I want to watch a 15-minute highlights edit of, say, a cycling Grand Tour stage or a cricket match or one of the other, golf majors, which I like to follow. None of that means that those sports should be boiling the length of their competition down to either 1 hour or 15 minutes or whichever type of highlights edit people are watching. I mentioned cycling there. I love following the big cycling events like the Tour de France and a lot of the ones underneath that. I don't watch any of them live because they go on for 4 or 5 hours, and I tend to be at work when they're going on. But I'll sit down in the evening and record a 1 hour highlights edit of something like the Tour de France, or we've had the Tour of Spain very recently, which I'm a bit behind on actually. But I want to see what happened over that 4 or 5 hours. That's what makes it interesting. It's that test of endurance in that sport. Nobody involved in those sports should be going, well, loads of people watch the 1 hour at 7 o'clock at night. If we just had a 1 hour cycling race, that would be amazing. That's completely missing the point of this data. And I do worry. I think if people, and F1 is not the only place doing this. I've seen recent comments from someone quite high up in the NBA this week actually said the same thing. I think he said something like, we're a highlight sport now. We need to think about what that means. To suggest that the popularity of highlights means your live events should be shorter means you're either looking in the wrong place or you're misinterpreting your data.
There's also another truth here that if you want a better highlights package, then you need your main event to have more action and to be longer. So if you make your race shorter, then you're just going to lessen the possibility of having the best bits in your highlights package. So it's a complete nonsense to think if you want the highest quality highlights package, that some people are happy to follow F1 that way, and you draw them in and they're still an F1 consumer and you've still got all the benefits. You make the highlights package as good as possible. And that comes from 90-minute to 2 hour races. It doesn't come from a 30-minute Grand Prix that then you just have half of it on the highlights package. Because then the highlights would be pretty rubbish because you'd have to fill it with half of it being completely boring moments where cars aren't overtaken.
Yeah, sprints are the perfect example of this, aren't they? The shorter race just means fewer opportunities for things of interest to actually happen. There was a point in the brilliant Domenicali interview you guys did with Stefano before the summer break. We had our own interview with him, didn't we? Where you pressed him a bit on the issue of pay TV, and I didn't really like the answer because he did I got the impression that he couldn't say this, but his answer really was, if you think pay TV is too expensive, that's why we're on TikTok. And I really didn't like that attitude of, we are going to keep it being expensive to watch it live. And if you're too cheap or you can't afford to watch it live, then that's what the free platforms and the highlights are for. And I don't like. I feel a lot of sports are going down that route at the moment because TV revenues remain one of the big reliable revenue streams, but I think that's a dangerous path to go down longer term.
Yeah, and I think it's a slightly strange way to formulate the argument as well, that if highlights are popular, then they sit side by side with the main product, don't they? That's just how it happens. It's connected in so many ways. So, yeah, I think it would be a puzzling move to go in that direction. You don't really hear football talking about 90 minutes is too long, etc. I know all sports pretty much have had some kind of shorter, sharper, more entertaining, allegedly more condensed format. It's a subset of sporting. Innovation I find particularly fascinating, but most of them fail because they just don't work for people. So you've got to know what works for you and you've got to know how best to do that. But yeah, I as we pointed out, there are so many people who are watching the highlights who don't have access to the full feed. So yeah, there's a bit of trying to have your cake and eat it and a bit of misunderstanding cause and effect there. So yeah, I'd certainly, I think we're all in agreement, race lengths, not a problem. Don't shorten Grand Prix. Let's take some listener questions now from the Race Members Club. Huge amounts going on there in the community discussions and with bonus podcast, video, all that wonderful stuff. Hit the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the race if that sounds of interest to you. And to give you an idea of the kind of thing we do in the Race Members Club, we do a regular series called Book Club where I speak to authors about their latest books. And this week I've done an interview with Sky Sports F1 pit reporter Ted Kravitz, whose new book, F1 Insider Notes from the Pit Lane, has just been released. We'll have at the end of the episode a short clip from that. It's a 45-minute odd interview, but the clip obviously a lot shorter. It gives you an idea of the kind of chats we have and just one of the streams of content that we have in the Race Members Club. So listen out for that later. Right, John, the first question is to you from Robert Chambers. How do you grade the change of Red Bull team principal from Christian Horner to Laurent Mekies so far? In addition to the Monza win, things at Red Bull seem to have calmed down. Max seems happy, and even Yuki Tsunoda has been marginally better. And in this, John, I'm going to have to insist on a grade in the answer. That's very important.
Well, like an A to E grade.
Whatever grade you like, as long as you're not dodging the grade.
Okay. I would say probably a B in terms of there's been no kind of total falling apart of the team, and it's looked impressive. It's held together. But I think what is important and quite hard to kind of unpick at the moment is how much of what we're seeing at the moment is because Laurent is there and how much was already in place before he came on board. For example, they announced a big sponsorship deal last week with an investment company. This was something that, Laurent Mekies was there at the announcement and did all the photos, and it's a big deal for the team. But this was agreed by Christian Horner in Canada, for example. So he did the deal. So you've got this legacy thing. Then things like the Monza wing approach this year. They went super aggressive on the low wing. Downforce package for the first time. Proved to be the foundation for Max Verstappen's win. But this was decisions made 12 months ago when they had a terrible Monza last year, and they said, we need to do something bespoke for this season, and it came on board. So you've got these, part of the influence is still seeping through. But I think what has slightly shifted between Christian and Laurent is a more engineering focus from the top in terms of Laurent's very hands-on, speaking to drivers, speaking to the engineers, kind of getting heavily involved in something because it's his background. So you had his, push for Yuki's floor change in Belgium, for example, and the debate over, the two wing specs in Monza, getting heavily involved in that area. And Laurent talked last week about a kind of a risk-taking approach he's willing to take just to find out what the performance limits of the car are. So he said they took risks in Hungary, which I guess is related to setup and air approach. It backfired because they had a terrible weekend, and they took risks last weekend with the ultra low wing thing, and it paid off. So I think there's a more willingness to experiment and a focus that Max is a bit kind of more on board with, especially because now he can't leave anyway. So he's wedded to the team. So I think he's doing what he needs to do in this short period of time. But I think we haven't yet seen kind of the sliding doors impact of how things would have been different if Christian had changed yet.
Right, the next question for you, Glenn, and this was a question I had to throw in your direction from Jonathan Pennyworth. Is 2025 the 1996 remake no one asked for?
I assume this is a reference to Max Verstappen doing Michael Schumacher-like things with a car disadvantage, though, as you guys discussed on a podcast, he probably didn't have a car disadvantage at Monza. I have got that vibe. I've got that Schumacher 96 vibe. Whenever Max has done something unquestionably brilliant, and then, when he's rattling the cages of the McLaren drivers, whether it may just be in qualifying or troubling them early in a race before they've been clearing off in some of the races before Monza, I really have got that vibe. So I assuming that is the premise of the question from Jonathan, which I'm certain it must be. Yes, I think, but what it made me think of was, and I think this applied to Schumacher, and I think it's going to apply to Max as well, is that when you're a great driver, it's actually what you do when you're a slight underdog that people will remember. So on Bring Back V10s, we are more likely to get asked about a brilliant Michael Schumacher drive when Ferrari were at a car disadvantage than we are. Nobody ever asked us to talk about brilliant drives from 2002 or 2004, for example. And I think it'll be the same with Max. There'll be much more appreciation for some of the things Max has done in a year like this, or in years like 2019 and 2020, before he had a car to fight for and win a championship. Nobody's really, other than perhaps Verstappen fans, are going to look back on all the brilliant drives from 2023 when he was winning all the time. So it's in situations like this that the greats really get to show why they are so great.
I'm really interested you went down the sort of Schumacher underdog route, because I thought the question was more about the McLaren drivers having a kind of their own personal battle and that not quite firing the imagination. But I think you may well be right, given it followed after Monza. But there's that dimension as well. So you've got the brilliant underdog while there's two teammates in the best car who are having a battle that's sort of, it's ongoing, but hasn't quite captured the imagination in the way that the great title fights do.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't make that connection because I'm not obsessed with either of the McLaren drivers as I was for one of the Williams drivers in 1996.
Yeah, that's fair. But no, an interesting question, and certainly Verstappen. I was thinking, as we said in a recent podcast, we all agree Verstappen's been the strongest driver of the season overall. The next question I'll take comes from Michael Holden. Lando Norris gets a lot of attention for the mistakes he makes. Whilst there's no doubt Oscar has improved as a driver in 2025, how much do you think Lando has improved as a driver on last year? Yeah, it's easy to see the improvements with Piastri because he's gone from a second-year driver probably to a fourth or fifth-year driver in one bound, I would say, which is why he's been so strong. Norris, because of his experience, he's been in F1 racing since 2019. It's more kind of incremental improvements, so they're a little bit hard to detect. I mean, Lando thinks he's got a little bit better at judging when to reach for perfection and when not to, and perhaps there've been a few less of the bigger errors, shall we say, or the moments on qualifying laps and that kind of thing. It's quite hard to say, though. I think he will have improved. He has become a little bit more battle hardened and experienced, but you're kind of in the error bars almost of improvements. So I'd say, yeah, his biggest thing is I think he's got better at managing where he is mentally in his approach and trying to know when to criticize himself and that kind of thing, publicly at least. And that's probably helped reduce some of the pressure on him. But it's not a step change. So, yeah, that's what I say I've seen with Lando. So that's what you'd expect for a driver of that experience. Okay, the next question's for John from Protonic Arrow. Are Mercedes debating if they should loan out Kimi Antonelli to another team as a reason why they haven't confirmed their driver lineup? With Max Verstappen being confirmed at Red Bull, what's taking them so long?
No, they're not. But there is quite an interesting kind of shift of dynamic at Mercedes with Kimi. I think the contracts are quite simple. I think they want to get both lined up at the same time. They're kind of going through the final process of contracts. And with George, I think it comes down to things like driver appearance days and how many he does and how they're counted and all those tiny little details that are always the final step of contracts. So you have all the broad stuff that's quite easy to sort out. But when you get to the details, this is where things get complicated. So I think that's what's holding up both contracts. In terms of Kimi, Toto's absolutely adamant that he believes Kimi's the future, that he's confident he can do it. But I thought it was fascinating at Monza last weekend where he labelled Kimi's performance underwhelming. It was the first public criticism of him. And I just wonder if, because Toto doesn't say these things accidentally, it will have been said on purpose. And I just wonder if he feels that Kimi's, continuing making mistakes, continuing not delivering to the full potential, and that having wrapped him in cotton wool potentially and been supportive for all difficult times, maybe it's time to give him the stick and not the carrot, and perhaps force a bit of a wake-up call and stop him making these errors. Because I think, you can kind of get away with a mistake in FP1 in Zandvoort on a tricky track on a day when lots of people made mistakes. But you come off a weekend like that where you've been defended to the hilt, turn up at Monza, you're off in FP2 and your weekend's derailed. I think Toto knows this can't carry on like this. So maybe he feels this is a way to get Kimi to turn things around.
I thought it was a really interesting choice of timing to do it, because from seeing the way you guys analysed the rest of Antonelli's weekend, it seemed like by Sunday he'd kind of done an okay job. Like, his race wasn't terrible. And I thought that's why Wolff's chosen this moment as the time to go after Antonelli a bit. I kind of view it as almost old school football manager man management, where when a guy is completely on the floor confidence wise and having a terrible time, you're more likely to, that's when you protect them. You protect them at their lowest moment, but once they start showing some promise, and once they have a performance that's okay but not good enough, that's when you can be a bit harder on them. So I actually wonder if Antonelli gets to a point where he's being kind of solid and reliable but nothing special, that might actually be, we might see Mercedes start to put more pressure on him, whereas anytime he has a complete disaster, that's when you have to try to protect him.
Well, the next question goes to you, Glenn, from Acorn. Many pundits and fans romanticise driver feuds like Senna-Prost or the nastiness of Hamilton-Rosberg. Yet at Monza, McLaren showed that teamwork and fair play can coexist with fierce competition, a message far more valuable to young athletes than win at all costs. So shouldn't F1 celebrate drivers who model character, fairness and the spirit of high-performing teams that think strategically and honour everyone's contribution? Or do we still prefer the old-school drama of selfish rivalries and deliberate conflict for entertainment's sake?
We all prefer rivalries where there's a bit of nastiness and a bit of hatred and a bit of dislike and all those things, because it's such a big part of sport. It's even when it's being contested fairly, the competition should still be fierce. So I think people are always going to connect more with a rivalry that feels like it has more tension behind it. I certainly think, I'm not sure it's F1's job to celebrate the way the McLaren drivers are maybe following their, I won't call them papaya, rules, but McLaren certainly can. McLaren can say, we're working really hard here, and it's clear they are working hard to not have this become another Hamilton-Rosberg. And I guess what we saw at Monza for now is an example that they are controlling it. I do think, however, though, and this is a little peek behind our curtain, we can see that from our numbers on our various platforms, the McLaren drivers' championship fight isn't engaging fans, I would say, in the way that previous rivalries have. So the mentions there, obviously, Senna-Prost and Hamilton-Rosberg. Those are the two most famous examples, really, of teammates inside the same team who were fighting for championships and fell out. That's good for business. And at the moment, the McLaren fight hasn't grabbed people in the same way, probably because it's all too well-behaved and polite.
I think also there's a tendency to have to almost pretend that, because the question frames it as in fierce competition, but with honour, etc. And I see where you're coming from that. But they're also, there's too much pretending for my liking. Like at Zandvoort, Oscar Piastri had to sort of almost pretend that he was concerned about Norris having engine failure. He would have been delighted that happened. And it's not about it being an unfair game. He'll just thought, well, I've lost points through bad luck before. That's great. I'm now in a position that the points reflect. I think I've been better. That's how they think, because they're competitors. And it is, you don't need to be at all-out war and cross-centering it or whatever. We're not necessarily saying got to do that. But for me, the most important thing is it's honest. And I think it's one of the things that F1 tries to portray is that almost all the drivers are best friends and everything. And the reality is it's like any kind of environment, isn't it? Some of them get on, some of them don't like each other. Most of them are kind of fairly neutral about each other. They're not going to go and spend time with each other away from circuits. And most of them also will do almost anything to win. It's only in that last few percent of how far they're willing to go that there's any different. And I think that's just something that is there in sport. But you can do that while still being honourable and decent. But I just get a bit worried that sometimes that it kind of gets papered over, that this is what it's about. It is about competition.
Your Piastri reference about he should be allowed to kind of enjoy the fact that Norris has suffered an engine failure allows me to mention one of my favourite ever reactions in those situations, which is Fernando Alonso at Suzuka in 2006 when he drives past Michael Schumacher's stricken Ferrari that has just suffered an engine failure. You're on board with Alonso and he's punching the air. We've talked about it on Bring Back V10s before. There was no Fernando Alonso there trying to dress it up and go, oh, you don't want to gain an advantage in a championship this way. That was a championship fight that didn't explode into collisions and that sort of thing, but there was a lot of tension between Renault and Ferrari behind the scenes. I just love the fact that Alonso just showed us what he really thought when he drove past his rival's stopped car.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit more sort of honesty in it, I think, would be
genuine. We want it to be genuine.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, Piastri and Norris do not hate each other. They just don't. They do get on decently, but they also desperately want to beat each other. There's no doubt about that. And there could be points where some of those McLaren racing rules are tested late in the season. And the last question I'll take from Harry, a hypothetical question. Given most of the races this year, inclusive of Monza, have seen less tyre degradation leading to more one-stop races, would the 2005 no pit stop rule make the racing a bit better in 2025? Well, I guess it would incentivize making moves on track because you can't do it on strategy, and tyre management would be probably an even bigger thing overall. So you might see a few more variables in that regard. But yeah, the no stop, this kind of mandatory no stop, I didn't really like. I think you could argue that maybe you take away the being forced to stop and make a no stopper a la Berger 86. That's one of my favourite one stoppers, or no stoppers rather, or Capelli 90 in France. Make that possible, but I'm not sure mandating it would actually make it more interesting. I think the net gain would be, it'd be a net loss. I think it'd be less interesting and less variables.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in 2005, it wasn't no pit stops. It was no tyre changes. They were still pitting. You still had strategy through refueling back then. I would be open to what you said there, Ed, that take away a pit stop being mandatory. So I wouldn't force races to be no stop, but I would be interested in this. So we were talking about Stefano Domenicali earlier. In this era of let's try things, we could have a Grand Prix where that mandatory element is taken away. So if you want to zero stop, you can try it. And until the teams work out what's the best way to do it, you might have the odd race where somebody does try and go the whole way, presumably on a set of hard tyres, and then someone behind pits for fresh tyres and tries to get after them. And that might be interesting. I'd also be open to going the other way, though. Karun Chandok, friend of the show, has often said he'd love to see some races where you had to use all three compounds in a race, which would give us two stoppers as well. I'd be up for all of these things being tried. And to come back to the big debate we had earlier on, all things like this, I'd be much more interested in seeing rather than a Grand Prix that was shortened to, say, 45 minutes or an hour.
Very good callback to an earlier topic there. I like that, yes. Well, variables create good racing, and Monza, I think, probably could have been a no stopper because Ocon went almost to the end of the race, for example, after starting on hards. Well, thanks very much, Glenn and John, for your excellent answers. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Remember to hang around after we finish because we will have that excerpt from the Ted Kravitz book about his new book, F1 Insider Notes from the Pit Lane. But for the time being, we're going to head off looking towards Baku, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One. Obviously, one of the great challenges with something like this is picking out what stories to tell, because you've got a finite amount of time. You can't tell every single story, and there's a lot of the ones that people would expect in there, because I guess there were some that you think, yeah, this is a very obvious thing to talk about. It makes sense to talk about Austria 2002, to talk about Singapore 2008, Schumacher Ras Cascade, all these things. But how did you go about choosing which of those stories to tell? Because I imagine you could have filled the book 10 times over with these ones.
I could. I prioritized it according to what I had that was new that I hadn't read elsewhere. So these were all stories that we've all heard about, we've read about it, we've listened to them on Back V8s, we've and we've looked at your work that has been done on them. And this is stories that I felt, well, this nobody knows this and that. And so they were my perspectives and the extra details that I had that I remembered. And it was a sort of, I've got a good memory for these kind of things to bring that back, that I felt that could add some value and some interest to the reader, which is what I wanted to do. So it's pretty simple, actually. Just anywhere where I could add some details, which would explain also in the terms of how I do the job. So there's a bit about an interview with Ross Brawn, who was pretty annoyed with me after Austria 02, because I'd kind of given him a clue as to that I thought it was a bit of a duff move and an unsporting move to make Rubens give the win to Schumacher when it wasn't really necessary for the championship. And nobody knows that he came up to me in Monaco the week after and had a go at me and was like, why did you just walk off on me? That was pretty rude. And from a TV perspective, then it was interesting to explain that these are, you only see from the camera's point of view, you only see Ross Brawn, and there may be a couple of people either side of him. What you don't see is that I've got, Italian TV there, Austrian TV there, I've got French TV here, and I've got someone else here. And we're all in a scrum trying to get into an interview. And if I've gone in and got it fairly early, which, I don't insist on being first, but I'd like to think that I try and get in there fairly early. And because I've got a demand from my producers to get it out quite early, if it's an interesting or important interview, I do then have a professional courtesy to get out of the way and allow other people in. So that was what happened with Ross. He finished his last explanation, and then I just turned away, said in the microphone, "Okay, thanks very much, Ross. Thanks for explaining," and ducked out of the crowd. And all he saw was me just doing that, ducking away, which is why he came up to me afterwards and said, "What was that about?" So that's a story that I hadn't told people before. So yeah, it's stories that we all know about, but told in a different way with extra detail and information that hopefully people will find interesting.
Well, you saved me asking a question now, because I was going to ask you about exactly that vignette with Brawn, because I thought it was a good illustration of the kind of things. But one of the things that also interested me is when you're telling these stories, finding the best way to tell them. I thought about this when you talked about the Brawn story, the double diffuser. And there's a really brief reference to the double diffuser and about the visible from beneath the bodywork. But I mean, I know if you were explaining the Brawn double diffuser, you'd go into more detail about how that really worked and holes and enclosed holes. And there was a reference to that. But obviously you've had to kind of reduce it down to avoid telling that aspect of the story in depth in order to tell the story you're telling, if you see what I mean. So you probably had to be quite selective in terms of where you reduce down what you're talking about in order to focus on what you're trying to do with the book, if you see what I mean. Because the book is not about having 5 pages on the double diffuser controversy. It's there and there's talk about it and you hang connected stories off it. Yeah. But I kind of imagine there was a version of this that had a longer version of that, and you maybe had to think, no, that needs to go because that's actually not central to what you're really trying to do.
Well, there was, but I actually discussed with my editor whether I could put some drawings in there as well. And I just wanted, because I remember looking at the double diffuser so keenly, and there was this line with people who didn't have a double diffuser. It was so obvious. You could see it came up from, if you imagine the 2 rear wheels are there, there's a line that came up, a solid line that went across the diffuser and then down again. And then the double diffusers didn't have that. They had this break-in and this lovely detail in there. And even now, in a book, I'm able to explain that, or a podcast, I'm able to explain that to people watching a video, in a way that I couldn't, because we couldn't really put another picture plate. You only have 16 or so many pictures. I didn't feel it was worth spending one of those pictures on an image of the double diffuser. I liked the extra detail about Minagawa, the engineer who came up with it. And while that is, again, back to these stories that have been told, if you watch the Keanu Reeves North One produced Disney Edd documentary on Brawn, Minagawa is in there. They found him, they interviewed him. Oshima-san, the Honda executive who Brawn gave £1 to, is in there. He holds up the pound famously. So in a sense, I felt those stories had already been told in a certain way, and I didn't want to elaborate more on people who had seen, because I would hope, or maybe expect, that a lot of people reading F1 Insider might have seen that Brawn documentary. But I did want to convey the idea, the frustration from the likes of Ferrari and Red Bull, that it came boiled down to the discussion of when is a hole not a hole, when it's a discontinuation of a surface, which is the way I explain it in there. And so that was where I felt there was a compromise to be made.